Oh, Canada. No, stop it. Not the bloody national anthem. Okay. Canada has many cities, right? So what makes a city good as opposed to bad? Well, affordability, walkability, public transit, history, architecture, culture, geography, proximity to natural features, the weather. Hey, this is Canada, bud. You're gonna get a lot of snow regardless of where you live. That's debatable. Nice umbrella, dude. Thanks. You never know when it might rain. Wait, hold up. Who are you guys? I'm Van City, of course. I'm always on these lists. Oh, right. Cool. Yo guy, this Toronto, we mustn't know what? Toronto? No, Toronto fam. Uh-huh. Hopefully we won't have... Yeah, it's a beauty, eh? It's Calgary, baby, so I'm at least top 2, eh? And I ain't second. Oh, Lee, look who came through. Everyone's here, dude, even this type. Merci pour le parapluie. T'inquiète, Québec, laissez poser. I have a feeling I'm gonna be cheesed by the end of this. Why is she so quiet, eh? Oh, she doesn't speak any English. I don't mind that, you feel me? She a thing still. Just touches with a wasteman like you in Montreal. Tu dis de la sauce en masse, big? She's my sister, you moron. Oh, and speaking of sister, yours wasn't too bad last night. Hehe. Nice it, French guy. I'm about to deface you fam real quick. Okay, yo, calm down, Toronto, or I'm gonna have to regulate you. That's right, I speak your lingo, fool. Yeah, I don't know. Alright, enough with the crappy accents that I can't pull off. Here's the top 10 cities in Canada, and why.
Ricky, what's the capital of British Columbia?
Victoriaville.
Number 10. Victoria, British Columbia. Located on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, this Pacific Ocean city is the actual capital of British Columbia, not Victoriaville, Quebec, which, albeit being the birthplace of poutine, isn't that interesting in comparison. Now, Greater Victoria, BC has roughly 400,000 people, making it Canada's 16th largest urban area. Benefiting from a natural harbor in a strategic position facing the entrance of the Puget Sound, Victoria developed as a major port city for the British during the colonial era, but was quickly replaced as the main settlement in BC by Vancouver when the Canadian Pacific Railway to that city was completed in the late 19th century. Since then, Victoria has always been in Vancouver's shadow, but that doesn't mean it isn't one of Canada's best cities. In terms of geography, Victoria lacks a river and some elevation changes, but its generous coastline, natural harbor, and beaches make up for it, as well as a nice but distant view of the Olympic Mountains in neighboring Washington state. So, overall, it gets a geography score of 4 out of 10. You may think that's harsh, but Victoria is quite flat, and besides its coastline doesn't offer much else compared to some other cities on this list. You'll see later on. Now in terms of weather, my criterion for this top 10 is solely based on snowy and rainy days. For Canadians, snowy days are less annoying than rainy days because while it sucks to shovel and drive in the snow, you can still go outside and do winter sports or whatever when it snows, right? But when it rains, people usually stay inside. That's why a snowy day will count as half a rainy day, and the combination of both will determine how much of the year is precipitation free, making the city more desirable throughout the year. Victoria ranks 7th out of all the Canadian cities on this list, meaning its weather is not that great, being quite rainy but not that snowy. So instead of having snow in winter, Victoria tends to have cold rain, which is a lot worse, giving it a score 4.73 out of 10. Now, if you didn't know...
Of course, we know that Canada dealing with a major housing crisis, so
The housing crisis.
Canada's housing crisis,
biggest housing bubble of all time.
The cost of living crisis, high interest rates, a housing market that remains very expensive in major cities, plus an influx of newcomers putting pressure on supply.
That's why my cost of living criterion for this top 10 is based on housing costs for that area. Victoria is the second least affordable city in this top 10, using a rent-income ratio calculation based on household income in the metropolitan area and a rent average using Numeo's rent data for the core city. Victoria's rent-income score of 2.82 out of 10 essentially gives us an estimate of how much of one's income you need to spend on housing, with the lower the score, the least affordable the city is for people living and working there. Next up is walkability and cycling. which I've merged together as a single active mobility criterion. Now, if you don't personally care about walking or cycling, that's your choice, but most people want to live in cities that are free adoption as opposed to cities that don't. And cities that are denser, walkable, and cycling friendly do also look much better objectively speaking. For a North American city, Victoria has some decent amount of density and, is walkable enough, but it doesn't have that many bike lanes. Basically, you could live without a car in Victoria, but you'd also have some issues to deal with, so I'm giving it a 5 out of 10, which is pretty decent for Canada. Then we have public transit score, or transportation in general. I've quantified this criterion with a simple system. If a city has a bike sharing system, it gets 1 point. If it has a bus system, it gets 2 points. If it has a BRT or light rail or commuter rail or anything in between a bus and a rail metro system, it gets 2 points. Finally, if it has a metro system, it gets from 1 to 5 points depending on the quality and reach of this metro system. In Victoria's case, it only has a bus system, giving it a score of 2 out of 10. Finally, the last criterion is culture, which is determined by how much that particular city has a cultural impact and outreach. Does it have renowned landmarks, festivals, unique cuisine, or architecture to the city? Does it have major sports teams, or, do famous musicians generally go on tour there? Or does it host every year a major event like a Formula One race? That type of thing. Victoria lacks a lot in the cultural department, aside from having British Columbia's legislative building. It's pretty dry, so it gets a culture score of 1 out of 10, very minimal. On average, Victoria has a score of 3.425 out of 10 for all 6 categories. Number 9. Sherbrooke, Quebec. With 250,000 people in this metropolitan area, Sherbrooke is Quebec's 3rd largest city if we exclude Gatineau, which is already included as part of Ottawa's metropolitan area. Sherbrooke is located in southeastern Quebec, just east of Montreal and south of Quebec City, in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains at the confluence of the Magog and Saint François rivers. With a hilly city center, some waterfalls and lakes, and plenty of mountains around to go skiing or hiking, Sherbrooke has pretty decent geography all around, giving it also a score of 4 out of 10. It's nothing too exceptional or unique, but it's charming enough. Now, its weather score is worse than Victoria's, mainly because it has a lot of snowy days. So in that effect, if you want a real winter with lots of snow, Sherbrooke will deliver. In terms of affordability, Sherbrooke is the 2nd most affordable city in this top 10, with a rent income score of 4.46. However, it doesn't have the greatest walkability, being more of a classic car-centric North American town. Downtown Sherbrooke is fairly walkable though, and it is small enough, with some bike paths here and there to bike around. That being said, the second you get out of downtown, it's basically suburban-style housing and businesses, hence my score 3 out of 10. At least you can take public transit to go around, as Sherbrooke does have a bus network, but unfortunately only that, giving it a public transit score of 2 out of 10. Finally, in terms of culture, Sherbrooke is fairly insignificant, not only in Canada as a whole, but even in the province of Quebec, so I'm also giving it a minimal score of 1 out of 10. So what really saves Sherbrooke from being 10th instead of Victoria is how much more affordable it is compared to British Columbia's capital. Number 8. Halifax, Nova Scotia. This Atlantic Ocean city in the southeast of Canada is very similar to Victoria in terms of cityscape. They're both coastal cities with natural harbor, but Victoria has a slightly better score there because of the mountain views, so Halifax gets a geography score 3 out of 10. Its weather is also very similar to Victoria's, with a score 4.69 out of 10, but still kind of average on the greater Canadian spectrum. It's a coastal city, so naturally it does rain a lot. Regarding cost of living, and despite popular belief, Halifax is actually not that affordable, having a rent income score of 3.44 out of 10, which is significantly lower than Sherbrooke's and in the bottom half among the cities on this list. As I previously mentioned, Halifax's cityscape and geography is very similar to Victoria's, so it also has the same active mobility score of 5 out of 10, which is pretty decent for North America, all things considered. In terms of public transit, they also have the same score, with Halifax only having a bus system, unfortunately for them. I know the geography isn't really suitable for a rail system, but can Halifax at least get a freaking BRT network with some kind of bike sharing, please? That'd be some minimal add-ons to benefit the area, like come on, Nova Scotia. Overall, what helps Halifax compared to Sherbrooke and Victoria is its culture score, which is a 2 out of 10. Why? Well, Halifax has a citadel in the middle of the city, which is a significant historic site, as well as Georges Island. It's also a much older city with more history, even though it hasn't retained much or even any of its colonial architecture. Don't get me wrong though, it's still pretty dull in terms of culture compared to larger cities, but it's not like there's nothing either. That gives Halifax an average score of 3.522 out of 10, showing that those three cities are pretty neck and neck. Number 7. Ottawa, Ontario. Ottawa is not only the capital of Canada, it's also a unique city in the country for being at the border of another province. In this top 10, I'm pretty much judging metropolitan areas because municipal borders are so arbitrary, they don't accurately represent an urban agglomeration. Like, there's no difference between living in Mississauga or Brampton, or Westmount or Montreal, you know? It's the same continuous settlement. So that being said, Gatineau in Quebec is included when I speak about Ottawa in this video. Now, Ottawa is located on the Ottawa River, at the confluence with the Rideau River, but other than that, Ottawa's geography is boring as hell. It's flat, there's a couple rivers, and that's it, so I'm giving it a score of 1 out of 10. In terms of weather, Ottawa is pretty much middle of the pack here, having a score of 5.86 out of 10. It has a lot of snowy days but not that many rainy days, so it's a fair representation of Canadian weather in general. It's also funny to know that compared to places like London in the UK, which is often cited by Brits themselves as a place where it supposedly always rains, well, despite being super inland, Ottawa has more rainy days and a lot more snowy days, yet nobody living there complains about it being rainy, so I don't know, matter of perspective I guess. In terms of affordability, Ottawa is also middle of the pack, having a random score of 4.05 out of 10. There's also been a life hack of sorts for public servants working for the federal government, where they decide to live in Gatineau rather than Ottawa proper, because it's cheaper to live in Quebec than Ontario. But living in Quebec has other challenges that anyone interested in moving to the Ottawa region might want to consider. If you want to understand more about why Quebec is so different from the rest of Canada, do watch my video explaining Quebec, right here. Now, the Ottawa region as a whole is not that walkable or cycling friendly. Like Sherbrooke, the center of the city is decent enough, but once you leave that, you're in a traditional car-centric North American suburbia. But since there are more walkable parts here and there, it gets a score of 4 out of 10. In terms of public transit, Ottawa is not that bad, but definitely not great. It has no bike sharing system, it does have a bus system, a light rail and a BRT network in Gatineau, so overall it has a transit score of 4 out of 10. Finally, Ottawa is culturally significant in Canada and even globally. It has major landmarks like the Parliament of Canada or the Rideau Canal. It has major sports teams, a plethora of museums, but other than that, it lacks a unique architecture and cuisine, as well as more often than not missing out on big artists' tour locations. So it gets a culture score of 6 out of 10. Not bad, not that great either. And an average total score of 4.152. Number 6. Edmonton, Alberta. Alberta's capital and second largest city also has terrible geography like Ottawa. It's flat, it has a North Saskatchewan River meandering through it, and that's it, so same geography score of 1 out of 10. Where Edmonton scores big is in terms of weather. It has the second best weather in this top 10, with a score of 7.16 out of 10 thanks to a drier prairies climate and having a lot less rainy days. It also scores big when it comes to housing, being the most affordable city in Canada with a random score of 5.9 out of 10. Hey, if you want nice weather and affordable housing, well, in a Canadian context at least, Edmonton is the city for you. However, it's not so great when it comes to active mobility. It's very car-centric. You're not even 200 meters out of downtown and you're in suburbia, so the missing middle is really missing in this city. The vast majority of the urban fabric is suburbia-style single-family home neighborhoods, and, you know, The biggest mall, not only in the country but in North America as a whole, so including the United States, is located there. Yeah, West Edmonton Mall is that big. In terms of public transit, Edmonton has a light rail and a bus system, giving it a score 4 out of 10. Once again, nothing exceptional. Culturally speaking, Edmonton is not as significant as Ottawa. It's quite a young city with little history. It does have some major sports team, but no significant landmark or unique architecture. So it gets a culture score 4 out of 10, because it's still on some people's tour dates. That gives Edmonton an average score 4.177 out of 10, just slightly better than Ottawa. Number 5. Calgary, Alberta. Edmonton's eternal rival further south, Calgary has similar geography, with the Bow River flowing through the rather flat city. What gives Calgary an edge, however, is the proximity and the views it has of the Rocky Mountains further west, giving it a geography score 3 out of 10. Calgary also beats Edmonton by having the best weather in Canada, with a score of 7.4 out of 10, mainly due to having slightly less rainy days overall. Scoring 4.47 out of 10, Calgary is also the 4th most affordable city on this list for its inhabitants, which is much lower than Edmonton, but much better than most other Canadian cities. Like its rival, Calgary is very car-centric and has a similar cityscape, giving it an active mobility score 4 out of 10. While it has a bus system, a BRT, and a light rail too, giving it also a public transit score of 4 out of 10. But Harsing, Calgary has a BRT when Edmonton doesn't. Surely it should have a higher score there. No, it shouldn't. BRT and light rail, to me, are equivalent. BRT is a cheaper but more maneuverable alternative to light rail, while light rail is essentially the dollar store version of a metro system when a city is too dumb and cheap to get a real practical metro system. Considering how, for instance, Calgary's Max BRT Purple Line is intended to be converted into a C-Train light rail line in Calgary Transit's latest 30-year strategic plan, it just proved my points that it's all the same thing. I mean, sure, Calgary might be ahead with its network, but not by much. Neither city has a real metro system, so they're both subpar in my book. In terms of culture, Calgary is fairly average, scoring 5 out of 10 for having a certain regional radio culture, as well as being a significant itch when it comes to being a concert destination or having major sports teams. But Calgary is quite lacking in terms of unique architecture, cuisine, landmarks, or international stature. That gives Calgary an average score of 4.478 out of 10, putting it further ahead than Edmonton and Ottawa, but not by much. Number 4. Quebec City, Quebec. Let's start with the obvious here. Quebec City has the second best geography of any city in Canada, with a score of 9 out of 10. Just look at it. It has rivers, it has hills, it has mountains, it has views, it has an island. You want to go hiking or ski, Stoneham, Mont-Saint-Anne, Le Massif are all next door. You want to see cool waterfalls, Chaudière, or Montmorency are right there. It misses out on having a perfect 10 out of 10 geography score because it doesn't have beaches. I can already hear some people mention, hey, what about the Baie de Beauport? That doesn't count. Stop it. It's an artificial beach. Come on. Now, Quebec City's weather is not so great, with a score of 4.8 out of 10, mainly due to being one of the snowiest cities in Canada. 3 meters of snow every year. That's almost 10 feet. In any case, Quebec City is the 3rd most affordable city on this list, just behind Edmonton and Sherbrooke, with a rent income score of 4.94 out of 10. In terms of active mobility, Quebec City is very similar to Ottawa. Some neighborhoods like Saint-Roch or Limoilou or the Old City are very walkable, but once you're in places like Sainte-Foy or Beauport, you absolutely need a car. When it comes to cycling infrastructure, it's also very lacking for a city of that size, but they've been improving lately. Their current mayor is very progressive in that regard, so there is hope. That being said, it only gets a score of 4 out of 10 in that category. Now when it comes to public transit, Quebec City has a bike-sharing system as well as a bus network, giving it 3 points out of 10. I would have given it an additional point for having a tramway network under construction, but construction hasn't begun yet. In fact, the whole project has been frozen by Quebec's conservative premier, François Legault, citing bullshit excuses like needing more studies, even though there have been studies on the project for over 20 years. It's purely a political decision, rather than an urban swan. But let's not go on a tangent on Legault and his incompetent government. We'd be here all day. Let's instead move on to culture. Quebec City has a nicely preserved old town as well as fortifications, being the only walled city in the US or Canada. It is one of the oldest European settlements on the continent and has a plethora of landmarks, museums, historic sites such as the Quebec Citadel, the Quebec Parliament, or the Chateau Frontenac. It has major festivals, a unique city-specific architecture, as well as regional cuisine not found elsewhere in the world and part of the greater Quebec culinary traditions. However, Quebec City lacks in sports teams and also in being a concert destination for major musicians. Sure, it gets some major groups and solo artists now and then, but not to the same extent as the top 3 cities in Canada do. So overall, Quebec City gets a culture score of 7 out of 10. This means it has an average score of 5.79 out of 10, putting it significantly ahead of all the cities below it, but also quite lower than the cities above it, making Quebec City the undeniable 4th best city in Canada. Number 3. Toronto, Ontario. Toronto may be Canada's largest city, but it's also Canada's 3rd best city. It is mainly due to 2 criteria, geography and affordability. First off, Toronto has an okay geography. It's by Lake Ontario, one of the Great Lakes. It has a couple rivers, some islands, the Scarborough Bluffs, and the lower down parklands, but it's otherwise super flat and there's a whole lot of nothing outside of it, giving it the geography score of 4 out of 10. Thankfully, Toronto's weather is quite decent, being the 3rd best in the country with a score of 6.31 out of 10, mainly because it doesn't snow as much. However, Toronto is the 3rd least affordable city in this ranking, having a random score of 3.04. Housing in Toronto sucks. It's expensive, your choice is either an apartment tower or a single family home, although they thankfully removed single family only exclusionary zoning last year, so there's progress in that regard, but overall it's terrible. A house like this sells for over $1 million. Not great. Now in terms of active mobility, so walkability and cycling, Toronto is alright, especially for North America. I gave it a score of 7 out of 10 because while the core of Old Toronto is great for that category, all the surrounding neighborhoods like Scarborough or Etobicoke, as well as cities part of the Greater Toronto area like Mississauga, Brampton, Oshawa, Richmond Hill, they're all super car-centric. In fact, there is a huge sprawling trend in the whole GTA, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down, so minus points in that regard. Regarding public transit, Toronto has a bike-sharing system, a bus system, a streetcar network, commuter rail with GO Transit, and it has a subway. Its subway is pretty decent, but it's definitely not as extensive as it should be for a metropolitan area of that size, and they're combining light rail to their network with the upcoming Eglinton and Finch West, which is very idiotic, especially for Eglinton, which was initially supposed to be a real subway line considering the expected demand for that corridor. Also, Toronto's streetcar network is complete garbage. But I'm a hater, so I'm not going to remove points for that, even though I really want to. All in all, Toronto gets a transit score of 8 out of 10, which is not perfect, but it's still very good, comparatively. Finally, Toronto has a fantastic culture score of 9 out of 10, mainly due to its international stature, the fact it always attracts musicians for concerts due to its size, the many professional sports teams, and other events in the city. Toronto is a global city and it has a fairly unique architecture as well as major landmarks like the CN Tower or City Hall. It has museums, it has pretty much everything you'd expect from a major global city. It also has its own dialect, slangs, its own subcultures, etc. That being said, it misses out on a perfect score because it lacks historical buildings. Essentially, Toronto feels like a modern city with little to no history. It's a bit harsh, but is the truth. That gives Toronto an average score of 6.225 out of 10. Number 2. Vancouver, British Columbia. It pains me to put Vancouver at number 2. I'm a Van City hater, but I try to make this list as objective as possible, so as expected, I gave Vancouver high scores. Canada's 3rd largest city has by far the best geography of any city in the country. 10 out of 10 geography. You have a natural harbor, a major river, the ocean, beaches, islands, and more importantly, beautiful mountains all around. Look at this landscape, man. Damn! Now you're probably wondering, how on earth can you hate Vancouver when you're in awe of its geography? Well, that's exactly why. I think they're mountains merchants. Vancouver's reputation is highly based on its scenery rather than its actual cityscape and urban design. For instance, Vancouver has terrible weather. It has the worst weather in all of Canada, with a weather score of 5.35 out of 10. But Hart's saying it's not as cold as the rest of Canada and barely ever snows. So, is a little bit of snow hurting you? That's cute. I thought this was Canada, bud. If you hate the cold and snow that much, migrate south, you snowbird. Pathetic. Vancouver is also the least affordable city in Canada, with a rent income score of 2.56 out of 10, being a notorious center for NIMBYs and other parasites who are responsible for the housing crisis. Regarding active mobility, Vancouver is not bad at all, with a score of 6 out of 10. It has decent cycling infrastructure for North America, nothing amazing but generally good for the continent, similar to Toronto, but not as great in terms of walkability outside of downtown, and like Fairview maybe. Basically, you gotta live near a SkyTrain station to have anything remotely dense enough to be walkable in the region. Speaking of SkyTrain, Vancouver has a transit score of 7 out of 10. It has a bike-sharing system called Mobi, a bus network, the C-Bus Ferry, the West Coast Express commuter rail line, and last but not least, SkyTrain, its light metro network. Now, due to it being a light metro and not a real metro, I only give it one extra point. I'm not a fan of SkyTrain, even if Vancouverites keep praising it. You guys just don't know any better system, so you think it's great, but as an outsider visiting Vancouver, trying to go around to different places, it's very disappointing. No line to UBC or North Van? Canada Line is slow as hell? And there's awful service connectivity downtown? Vancouver deserves way better. I gave Vancouver a culture score of 8 out of 10, being very similar to Toronto in terms of notoriety, city subcultures, architecture, general urban identity, having sports teams, festival, yada yada. But like Toronto, it lacks historical buildings, and it also has no real landmark aside Canada Place. You could argue maybe that Lionsgate Bridge is a landmark, but it's kind of hidden outside of Stanley Park and not central to the city, so it looks like the Dollarama version of the Golden Gate Bridge, so nah. Overall, Vancouver has an average score of 6.485 out of 10, making it slightly better than Toronto, but only really due to its geography. Number 1. Montreal, Quebec. Located on a set of islands in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, Montreal is a city surrounded by water, with hills and Mount Royal at its heart, as well as lakes and Montérégie Hills. Its unique location nested between the Laurentian Mountains to the north and the Appalachian Mountains to the south makes it quite practical for hiking and skiing enthusiasts. I was tempted to give it a 9 like for Quebec City, but I had to remove a point for having its own cardinal directions, which can be very confusing for non-locals. As such, Montreal has a geographic score of 8 out of 10. In terms of weather, it's actually not that bad, with Montreal having the 4th best weather of all the cities in the top 10, with a score of 5.93 out of 10, very similar to nearby Ottawa and Quebec City. However, Montreal suffers from the same affordability problems as Toronto and Vancouver, although not yet to the same extent as them. Its rent income score of 3.76 out of 10 places it in the lower half, ahead of Halifax but behind Ottawa, Calgary, Quebec City, Sherbrooke, and Edmonton. When it comes to active mobility, no city in Canada beats Montreal. It has an extensive cycling network that is rapidly expanding thanks to a pro-cycling progressive mayor, and it has seasonal pedestrian streets all over, as well as enough density for people to live there comfortably without needing a car. You love cycling, you love walking, Montreal's for you. That being said, it's not perfect everywhere, as there are still some car-centric suburbs, but it's much better than anywhere else in the country, thanks to a rather large public transit network. Speaking of, Montreal's public transit gets a score of 9 out of 10. It has the best bike-sharing network in North America for its city size and one of the best in the world, having exported its system to numerous cities, including New York, DC, Toronto, and the real London in the UK. Its bus network is modern and efficient, with a variety of high-frequency lines, express lines, and a BRT line. Its commuter rail network is probably its weakest point, due to low frequencies, but the network itself reaches all of the main suburbs. Finally, Montreal has an extensive metro system, with a line being expanded, as well as a light metro, the REM, which further expands the overall public transit reach. However, public transit in Montreal isn't perfect. It has some flaws and blind spots throughout the agglomeration, so it cannot get a perfect score. However, Montreal has a perfect culture score of 10 out of 10, owing to its very unique architecture, with its famous exterior staircases, its unique cuisine such as Montreal-style bagels and smoked meat, along traditional Quebec cuisine. It has major landmarks such as the Saint-Joseph Oratory, the Notre Dame Basilica, Montreal's Old Town and Old Port, its various bridges, its Olympic Stadium, the Biosphere, the Montreal Casino, or even unique-looking skyscrapers like Place Ville-Marie or the 1000 de la Gauchetière. Even Montreal's Chinatown has 4 python gates and a cooler historic look than its counterparts in Toronto and Vancouver. Montreal is home to major sports teams, as well as a Formula 1 race, many museums, very diverse neighborhoods, unique accents and dialects, whether in French or English, and internationally renowned festivals. Overall, Montreal has an average score of 7.615 out of 10, making it the firm number 1. So to recap, we have in order: number 10, Victoria; number 9, Sherbrooke; number 8, Halifax; number 7, Ottawa; number 6, Edmonton; number 5, Calgary; number 4, Quebec City; number 3, Toronto; number 2, Vancouver; and number 1, Montreal. Here's how these 10 cities rank within the specific categories, so if you favor one category or another, you can weight in the scores. Also, the reason some cities miss out, like Winnipeg, Regina, fake London, or St. John's, whichever of the two you're thinking of, is because they're not better than any of the cities on this list. You can argue your case in the comments. So, on that note,